Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, You Can't Handle the Truth. In this video we're going to be looking at Truthmakers and Truthbearers. Before we get started, as you can probably tell, this is going to be a pretty monstrous video. It's pretty long because I've gotten feedback from subscribers that says they want more in-depth videos on specific topics in philosophy. So here it is. If, however, you just want to sit through the first few minutes of this, get the basic concepts, you'll probably be fine for the rest of the series. But if you're interested in the deeper metaphysical issues of Truthmakers and Truthbearers here, then watch through to the end and see if you learn something. So, Truthmakers are simply those things that make something true, whereas Truthbearers are those things that are made true by Truthmakers. Seems like pretty simple, intuitive concepts. There are a number of different theories for what exactly a truthmaker is and how exactly it makes something true. We're going to offer a basic overview of these theories here. Possibilities for truth-bearers include things like sentences, tokens, propositions, judgments, beliefs, and so on. Here, we're going to explore if there are any limits on those things and what can and can't be made true. We'll answer the question, are there truths that can't be made true by any truth maker? But first, we'll offer some very basic definitions of three candidates for truth bearers, namely sentences, propositions, and beliefs. Note that when you get deeper into these issues, these definitions are contentious. We're only offering them to help increase understandings of the basic concepts. These are going to be oversimplifications to guide our investigation of other related topics. Usually we won't need to get into the fine-grained nature of these concepts to the point where it gets to those discussions and those divergences among philosophers and their opinions on these. So it's okay to just look at the oversimplifications for now. But if you're curious, you can do more research into these concepts, and hopefully at some point we'll do a separate series on truth bearers themselves. Sentences. Sentences are simply the collections of words that make up the things we say. You might offer a grammatical definition so that things like, I is on mountain, aren't sentences. But the important thing is that they're not identical to their meanings. Therefore, the sentence, snow is white, and the sentence, Schnee ist weiß, are not identical, even though they have the same meaning, namely snow is white, but in different languages. Sentences need not have agents to say them or larger context to give them meaning. Sentences are just the words that they're made up of. Propositions, on the other hand, are meanings of sentences. So while snow is white may be a different sentence from Schnee ist weiß, they both express the same proposition. There's a lot of debate on what exactly propositions are and how they're used. For more information, check out Propositions by Matthew McGrath on the SEP. We have enough to cover in this video right now, so we're not going to get into exactly what propositions are. Beliefs are generally taken to be kind of propositional attitude or opinion that one has about the meaning of a sentence. Belief is usually the propositional attitude which deals with accepting something to be true, either explicitly or implicitly. Once again, beliefs, like propositions, are pretty complicated things when you get down to the nitty-gritty. We're not going to cover a lot of that in this series, but hopefully in another series we'll look at that. So, now that we've talked a little bit about what truth bearers are, we're going to talk about some different theories of truth makers. We're going to look at the virtue theory of truth makers, the entailment theory of truth makers, the necessitation theory of truth makers, the essentialist theory, the axiomatic theory, and finally, the grounding theory. There are a lot of different theories. They all have their own problems as well as their own strong points. So, the virtue theory of truthmakers is probably the simplest theory, and it's maybe the most intuitive, what you might start with before you really get into the philosophy of it. So, one of the most basic theories of what a truthmaker is could be called the virtue theory. A truth maker is that in virtue of which something is true. Seems to make sense. But it's quite difficult to decipher such a theory, as it doesn't really offer sufficient information as to what is meant by in virtue of. It could make something true just by existing, or because it resembles it in some way. While this may give us some information as far as what a truth maker is, it seems to be far from sufficient to explain what exactly is a truth maker. Therefore, we might strengthen it and move on to the entailment theory. Perhaps we should look at a stronger theory than the entailment theory goes as follows. So a truth maker is a thing the very existence of which entails that something is true. So it's something existing and that entailing, logically or otherwise, the truth of some other thing, a truth bearer of some kind. Unlike virtue, entailment is a very clearly defined logical notion. So if some state of affairs exists, such as the cake being on the table, or the proposition the cake is on the table coheres with our other propositions, or any number of other qualifications to be enumerated in our discussion of the specific theories of truth in the following videos, then that logically entails that the truth bearer, the cake is on the table, is true. It's impossible that this condition holds and the truth bearer fails to be true. Basically, if the cake is on the table, then the statement, the cake is on the table, is true, taken as a logical entailment. However, logical entailment is actually a little bit of a strange concept. An entailment is only false if the antecedent, the first half, is true, and the consequent, the second half, is false. Look at the truth table on the side if you've forgotten how logical entailment works, remembering that the only time that the whole entailment is false is in that second line, where the first part, P, is true, and the second part, Q, is false. Note that there's no way for the entailment statement to be false if the consequent is true. In both lines 1 and 3, where the consequent is true, the entire entailment must be true, no matter what the antecedent is. Therefore, necessary truths, things that must be true, are in fact entailed by everything. By the entailment theory of truthmakers, this means the existence of an ant on my wall makes the law of the excluded middle true. Why is that true? Well, because a necessary truth is always going to fall into lines 1 or 3 of our little truth table over here. It doesn't actually matter what the antecedent is. Any entailment that has a necessary truth as its consequence is going to be true. So anything entails a necessary truth. So if entailment is just the same as making something true, then anything makes a necessary truth true. But it seems strange that an ant on my wall is what makes the law of the excluded middle true. That doesn't really make sense. Even if this conclusion wasn't bad enough, Riestall has pointed out that there are some even more disturbing consequences to come. So if everything makes the LEM true, then for anything that exists, X, any statement of the form P or not P must be true. Furthermore, Riestall puts forward something called the disjunctive thesis. If X makes P or not P true, then X makes P true or X makes not P true. Basically what we've done is we've distributed the truth-making property to both parts of the disjunction. X makes P true or X makes not P true. Therefore, for any statement that is true, any existing thing makes it true, since nothing can make it false. Basically, we use disjunctive syllogism on our new disjunction, and any existing thing makes, in fact, any statement true. If that was a little too abstract for you, we're going to take a look at it in a specific example. So, take the existing thing, a jar of pickles in the supermarket. This entails all logical truths, including the LEM. Therefore, it entails that either Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia, or Vladimir Putin is not the leader of Russia. By the entailment theory, this means that a jar of pickles makes it true that either Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia, or Vladimir Putin is not the leader of Russia. By the disjunctive thesis, furthermore, this means that a jar of pickles makes it true that Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia, or a jar of pickles makes it true that Vladimir Putin is not the leader of Russia. Note that all the disjunctive thesis is saying we can do is distribute truth-making between two parts of a disjunction. Since nothing can make a false statement true, we can dispense with the claim that a jar of pickles makes it true that Vladimir Putin is not the leader of Russia. So by disjunctive syllogism, all we're left with is the claim that a jar of pickles in the supermarket makes it true that Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia. However, clearly, a jar of pickles being in the supermarket has nothing to do with Vladimir Putin being the leader of Russia. And therefore, we've come to a very strange conclusion from what seemed like a very intuitive theory. For a challenge, try to prove that argument right there with predicate calculus. This video is already going to be long enough, so I didn't want to get into the proof right here, but offer it in the comments below to show off your mad predicate calculus skills. So, some have tried to defend the entailment theory by positing something of a relevance criterion, or objecting to the disjunctive thesis. However, the exact definition of what is relevant and what is not is still insufficient. There's not enough for us to tell us what makes a jar of pickles in the supermarket not be relevant to Vladimir Putin being the leader of Russia. And even if we discard the disjunctive thesis, we're left with the original problem that the existence of any object entails all necessary truths. Some philosophers, such as Armstrong, are convinced that the problem with entailment is that it makes a category mistake, since both halves of the entailment are statements. While a truth maker is a thing out in the world, and a truth bearer is a statement or belief or proposition of some kind. Instead, Armstrong proposes, a truth maker is a thing that necessitates something's being true. What do we mean by necessity? We're talking about the modal concept of necessary, something that's true in all possible worlds. Now, Armstrong's not going to put it in those words because he has a different concept of modality in possible worlds, but it still may be a helpful notion in understanding this concept. So basically, some truth maker necessitates some truth bearer to be true if there is no possible world where the truth maker exists and the truth bearer is false. And there is no possible world where the truth maker does not exist and the truth bearer is true. So, for example, my statement were to be, the ant is on my pencil, then there can be no possible world where there is an ant on my pencil and the truth bearer, there's an ant on my pencil, is false. And there can be no possible world where the truth bearer, there's an ant on my pencil, is true and there's not in fact an ant on my pencil. In other words, the existence of the truth maker is necessary and sufficient for the truth of the truth bearer. And yet there are problems with this conception as well. For example, all necessary truths necessitate each other. They all exist in all possible worlds, and yet they're distinct. And it would be strange to say that the LEM alone makes true something like 2 + 2 = 4. Additionally, Smith poses another problem for this theory. Suppose that God wills a particular act to happen, such as Richard kissing Sarjo. God's act necessitates this to happen. It can't happen if God did not will it. And if God willed it, it must happen. There's no possible world in which God wills it and it doesn't happen, or God doesn't will it and it does happen. And yet, it's not God's will that makes it true. It's the fact that Richard kissed Sarjo. That's what makes it true, not God's will. Smith tries to remedy this problem of necessitation by adding another criterion to Armstrong's theory, known as projection. So truthmaker is a thing that necessitates a judgment's truth and falls within the projection of that judgment. Note that we've moved on from kind of generic truth bearers to specifying that we're talking about judgments now. Judgment is a kind of belief. To understand this, we need to first see what Smith means by projection. So Smith says roughly it should be something that falls within the mereological fusion of all the objects to which reference is made in judgment. Or in other words, the truth maker needs to be some combination of all the parts. Remember, Mariology is the study of the parthood relation. So the Mariological fusion of all the objects just means the study of, or the fusion, the put together of all of the parts of the different objects. So basically, it should be some combination of all of the parts that are referenced in the judgment. When we look at the judgment, Richard kisses Sarjo, we see several parts. Two individuals, Richard and Sarjo, and the kissing relation. There's no Mariological sum of all of these things that includes God or God's will, that Richard kisses Sarjo. Therefore, God's willing it is not a truth maker for this claim. And yet it's been objected that this response is still insufficient, because Smith casts existence as a predicate. And so one of the parts of the judgment, Richard kisses Sarjo, is in fact existence. And all existing things are part of this. Therefore, God's will exists. So God's will is still a truth maker for that, as it's part of the judgment. Now we're going to move on to a little bit of a spookier theory of truth makers called essentialism. Another method of explaining truth makers is the essentialist position. This relies on the spooky concept of essences to make truth makers match their truth bearers. So a truth maker of a proposition is something such that it is part of the essence of that proposition, that it is true that that thing exists. What do we mean by that? Well, this seems to deal with some of the earlier worries, as surely God's will is not part of the essence of the proposition that Richard kisses Sarjo. And surely jars of pickles are not part of the essence of the law of the excluded middle, but it seems worrying that we haven't really given a definition of what an essence is. So before you become an essentialist, realize that you're going to be committing yourself to some pretty strange ideas. First off, you are committed to the proposition having meanings without anyone to say them. Propositions cannot mean anything other than they do. Many theories of meaning are going to balk at such a conclusion. Basically, propositions have to have some kind of meaning without someone having an intention of making them have a meaning. This is a little worrying for some people. Might not be worrying for you, though. And second, the concept of an essence is mysterious, spooky, poorly defined, and not something any naturalist would touch with a 12-foot pole. You might solve one problem, but you're going to let a menagerie of curious things into your ontology, and in so doing, you're going to create some novel problems for yourself. Perhaps then defining truth in terms of some other concept just is impossible. It's a primitive notion of sorts. Therefore, our job is not to define a truth maker, but to show how it works with other concepts, like truth and existence. Thus, we might offer an axiomatic theory. A truth maker is some TM such that TM makes it true that P implies P. That's truth. If TM exists, then TM makes it true that TM exists. An existence axiom. If TM makes P true and P implies Q, then TM makes Q true too. An entailment axiom. The point is, we would list a bunch of axioms of explaining how truth-making works with other concepts like truth, existence, and entailment, so on and so forth, instead of giving a direct definition of it. It might seem that by leaving our truth maker undefined and simply explaining how it works with everything else, we've solved some of our problems. And yet, even though we haven't given necessary and sufficient conditions for our truth maker, we're going to have a few worries, even though some of the major objections have been sidestepped. Even this seemingly minimal way to posit truth makers is going to lead to problems of its own. For example, if truth makers are closed under entailment, if some TM makes a truth bearer true, and that truth bearer entails something else, then the TM makes that something else true as well. As the axiomatic system that we presented avers, then we reopen ourselves to the problem of the jar of pickles making the law of the excluded middle true. Because if some truth maker makes a jar of pickles being in the supermarket true, and that entails something like the law of the excluded middle, once again, we're still going to get a chain of that causing a problem. Since anything entails the LEM, if there being a jar of pickles in the supermarket makes the claim true, there is a jar of pickles in the supermarket, which in turn entails all logical truths, the LEM included, then the jar of pickles still makes the LEM true. And all of the worrying consequences that we saw before will once again rear their ugly heads. So, one final attempt we're going to look at is the grounding method. This is recently presented by Schaeffer. It claims that truth makers can be defined in terms of our primitive notions of fundamentality and grounding. Ooh, what are these things? Because they're primitive notions, he's not going to really offer specific definitions for them. He's just going to kind of explain them and give ways that they interact with other concepts we have and give some examples. So, a truth maker TM for some proposition P in world W is something such that TM is fundamental in W, and the truth of P in W is grounded in TM. Clearly, this theory rides on what we mean by fundamental and what we mean by grounded. To defend such a position, Schaeffer must give us specific definitions of what he means by fundamentally and grounded. Schaeffer states that grounding, for example, is fine-grained enough to preclude such situations as the jar of pickles making the LEM true, since he claims that it can distinguish between different entities, food and logical truths. Seem like very different entities. But since it's a primitive notion, he's not going to give us a definition of it. Instead, he'll give us some explanation about the way in which it behaves with other ideas and concepts. Grounding, for Schaeffer, is a relation that is asymmetric. So, if a truth of X in W is grounded in TM, then TM is not grounded in the truth of X in W. If X bears the relation to Y, Y doesn't bear the relation to X. It's irreflexive. Nothing is grounded in itself, and it's transitive. If the truth of X in W is grounded in TM, and the truth of TM is grounded in some TM2, then the truth of X in W is grounded in TM2. If you're curious about these properties of relations we have here, and you don't know what I'm talking about, you should check out my video on the properties of relations, where we go through a bunch of different properties of relations that are out there. Schaeffer's also going to provide us with some examples of things that bear the grounding relationship to each other, in the hopes of making this more clear. The fact that Socrates exists is grounded in Socrates. The set of just Socrates, also known as Socrates' singleton, is grounded in Socrates. The wholes of Swiss cheese are grounded in Swiss cheese. Moral features are grounded in natural features. Mental properties are grounded in neural properties. And truths are grounded in truth makers. With all of these examples, Schaeffer hopes you can get an intuition about this primitive notion of grounding. Many philosophers are going to fail to see any resemblance between these varied examples that constitutes a primitive relation. Some, like Lewis, even deny the existence of things like sets, facts, and wholes, and the like, and therefore they don't have any use for such a primitive notion. Beyond these worries, we're once again using propositions, which seem to need to be self-interpreting. Schaeffer has failed to explicate how they can be otherwise. One way or another, there's more work to do on this theory before it could be accepted. Perhaps we can give an explanation of these primitive notions, but right now there's a lot of concerns and they're not very clear. Now we're going to kind of close on truth makers. We talked about virtue, entailment, necessitation, essentialist, axiomatic, and grounding theories. In the end, it does not seem that any of these theories of truth makers can really offer satisfactory conclusions without outrageous consequences. But before we finish this video, we're going to take a look at truth bearers. Now we're going to examine several theories, not of what kinds of things truth bearers are, propositions, statements, sentences, and so on. We kind of covered a little bit of that at the top of the video, but of what the content of truth bearers can actually be made true by some truth maker. Is it possible for all truth bearers to be made true by some truth maker? Or are there some true statements out there, true propositions, true beliefs, true truth bearers out there that have no truth maker? Positions here that we're going to look at include maximalism, optimalism, and truth supervening on being. Let's take a look. So maximalism is where we're going to focus. It's the most intuitive position here. So maximalism is probably the most intuitive position that can be made here. Basically, the maximalist thinks that anything that is in fact true has some truth maker. There's something that makes it true. That for all true statements, something makes them true. Note that we're not saying that each truth needs its own separate truth maker. There could be one truth maker for a number of truths. But we're saying that each truth needs at least one truth maker. Each truth bearer needs one truth maker that makes it true. This seems to make sense intuitively. It'd be weird if there were some truths that were not made true by anything. They simply were true for no apparent reason. Yet, maximalism is going to have some problems of its own. First, maximalism has to contend with its own version of the liar's paradox. Basically, this statement has no truth maker. If it has a truth maker, then it's false and can't have a truth maker. If it has no truth maker, then it's true, but nothing makes it true. So, it's a problem for the maximalist thesis. Note that this doesn't mean we should go to our usual versions of getting rid of logic or reformulating logic or having a problem with the paradox, because all we need to do to make the paradox disappear is simply reject maximalism. The paradox can be rendered falsitical or moot by simply denying maximalism. One might claim that it's nonsense or meaningless, but that seems to leave you open to problems of revenge paradox, such as this statement is meaningless or has no truth maker. And it would seem that meaningless statements also don't probably have truth makers, so even if you said it was meaningless, it would be true, interestingly enough. Unfortunately for the maximalists, this is only the beginning of their problems. David Lewis poses the following problem for maximalism. If it were the case that the statement, nothing exists, were true, then there would have to be something to make it true. But then something would exist, and that would make the statement false. So it seems that there's a statement that could be true, and in some possible world is true, and yet has no truth maker. And this just adumbrates a deeper problem for the maximalist thesis. While the truth makers for atomic statements, those are single statements that don't have a logical operator like and, or, if, then, and so on. We'll look at them more in the next video. Can be said to also be the truth makers for disjunctions, conjunction, and existentially quantified statements. They're going to struggle when it comes to things like negatives and universals. To see this clearly, let's look at an example. So imagine that P is, there's a jar of pickles in my pantry, and Q is, there are quail eggs in my fridge. Now imagine that the truth maker for P is TMP, that there actually is a jar of pickles in my pantry. And the truth maker for Q is TMQ, that there actually are quail eggs in the fridge. Note that we're taking a sort of kind of correspondence theory of truth here. Just to help illustrate the point, you could put in coheres with a set of beliefs, or is identical to, and so on and so forth. Whatever you really want for the theory. We're just using correspondence for the example. Remember, P v Q means P or Q, and P ampersand Q means P and Q. This would mean that TMP is the truth maker for both P and P or Q, just as TMQ is the truth maker for both Q and P or Q, because either the state of the pickles being in my pantry or quail eggs being in my fridge is sufficient to make the statement, either there are pickles in my pantry or quail eggs in my fridge, true. So both of those are truth makers for the statement P or Q. Similarly, the state of both there being quail eggs in my fridge and pickles in my pantry would lead to the statement P and Q being true. Or in other words, the combination of the truth maker for P and the truth maker for Q makes P and Q true. So in the same way we can talk about conjunction or disjunction, it doesn't seem difficult to talk about existential quantifiers or even modal quantifiers, depending on your understanding of modality and possibility, and definitely only in terms of possibility. There exists at least one jar of pickles seems to be made true by TMP, and it's possible there exists a jar of pickles seems to also be made true by TMP, but also possibly by some modal notion of a jar of pickles existing in some other possible world. The problem is going to arise when we talk about things like negative claims, universal claims, and especially necessary claims. So negation is going to be a problem for the maximalist. What makes not P true? Someone might say that it's something else being in my pantry. But no law of logic seems to dictate exactly how many things can be in my pantry at a time. It doesn't seem that because there's a bag of pasta in my pantry that it's the case that there's not a jar of pickles in my pantry. I might have a really big pantry. I might have thousands of things in my pantry. Just because there are other things there, it doesn't seem to make it true that there's not something else. And even if there was, this would be a negative rule. There can't be more than so many things in the pantry, and it would require a truth maker of its own, but we can't have negative truth makers, so we have something of a problem. Similarly, universal statements, particularly universal negations, are going to be difficult to find truth makers for. What makes it true that all pickles are green? It seems somehow insufficient to say that this is simply a conjunction of all the truth makers for each individual pickle, because suppose a new pickle were to grow. It doesn't seem that we then have to add that in. It seems we want a kind of generalized universal statement about pickles. The deeper problem, though, is how to say something like no pickles are orange, a negative universal. What does that have to make it true? The same problem is going to apply for modal claims, like it's not possible that a pickle is not a pickle. What makes that true? Even if we have a really wide concept of modality, the fact that it's not possible that a pickle is not a pickle, there's not going to be a truth maker in any possible world for that truth bearer. So what makes it true? In the face of these problems, Armstrong is going to posit what he calls totality facts. These are relations between aggregates, all the things with the property, and the property itself. A group of things bears the totality relationship to a certain property if they are the aggregate of that property, if they're basically all and only the things that have that property. Think of the property of being in my pantry. The aggregate of things in my pantry is a jar of pickles, a box of cereal, and a bag of pasta. This group of things bears the totality relation to the property of being in my pantry. If the group of things was a jar of pickles and a bag of pasta, it wouldn't bear the totality relation because it doesn't have all of the things included. Also, if it was a jar of pickles, a box of cereal, a bag of pasta, and a jar of quail eggs, then it still wouldn't bear the totality relation, because while it includes all of the things that are in my pantry, it includes something that's not in my pantry, namely quail eggs. This relation is the truth maker of the negative existential, that there are no quail eggs in my pantry. Similarly, the aggregate of all pickles bearing the totality relation to the property of being green is what makes the negative universal no pickles are orange true. My concern about new pickles growing, though, seems to still be pertinent here, and it's going to be a problem Armstrong is going to have to deal with, along with a number of other objections to Armstrong that are claiming that perhaps this is just a disguised version of negative facts, and that there's maybe an infinite regress of totality, since each totality does not include itself. Armstrong does have responses to these that seem to succeed, but what's curious is he has a weird way to explain existence and his ontological commitment, and most would say that he's actually ontologically committed to some really strange entities that are going to cause problems for the rest of his metaphysics. Basically, you're not going to be able to get out of some of these problems without having some strange entities wander into your ontology. In summary, you might be able to rescue maximalism from some of these objections, but it's going to take a great deal of work and end up with some strange conclusions. Now we're going to talk about optimalism. Optimalists try to avoid the problem of maximalism by denying that you need to have truth makers for negative and universal statements. According to the optimalist, we can tell if a statement is true or false if it has a truth maker or not. False statements simply do not. True ones do. This may seem like a promising way to avoid some of the problems for the maximalist, but there are still some worries that the optimalist fails to avoid. The liar paradox for optimalism seems problematic. This statement has no truth maker. If it has no truth maker, then it must be true, and therefore it has no truth maker. If it has a truth maker, then it must be false, which means that it has no truth maker, and is true. clearly it's going to be a problem. And once again, as we noted with the maximalist, just because this is a paradox doesn't mean we have to go all the way back into logic. We could just get rid of optimalism to resolve the paradox. So unless optimalism can resolve the paradox, this might be a reason to reject it. Though there's some concerns with underdetermination to note here of there's a paradox, what does that mean we should get rid of? Should we get rid of optimalism, or should we get rid of some basic laws of logic? The point is, though, that optimalism generally doesn't function without those basic laws of logic, so it would make more sense to drop optimalism as opposed to the laws of logic it relies on. We're going to talk a little bit also about truth supervening on being. So anyone that claims that truth merely supervenes on being has taken the role of truth to really the absolute minimum. If something is true, then it would not be possible for it to be false unless things were to exist which don't, or else certain things had not existed which do. So a statement like, "There's a jar of pickles," would be true, since the only way that it could be false is if something which exists, namely the jar of pickles, did not exist. In the same way, the statement "unicorns do not exist" is true, because the only way it could be made false is if something that does not exist were made to exist. But I still have my concerns. It seems that "there's a jar of pickles in my pantry" could be false if everything existed that does, but the jar happened to be somewhere other than my pantry. Just because nothing else has existed or not existed doesn't mean that the statement is necessarily true. Since the statement can be false, but nothing new exists or has stopped existing, it cannot be true that I have a jar of pickles in my pantry, even though that I do. This is a problem for truth supervening on being. Perhaps one might defend the doctrine by claiming that the existence of the jar in one place or another is caused by something that must exist and put it there. So there's no way for me to get those two scenarios of a jar of pickles being in my pantry and a jar of pickles being in my fridge without there existing or not existing something out there that made it. One can perhaps speak of the initial conditions of the universe and go all the way back to a sense of causation. But surely, even when looking at the initial conditions of the universe, where things were was just as important as whether or not they existed. But with the supervenience theory, this doesn't seem to be able to be taken into account, because we're only talking about existence, not position. Now, one might go farther to defend this position by claiming that by existence we're talking not about just the jar of pickles, but perhaps the state of affairs of the jar of pickles being in the pantry versus the state of affairs of the jar of pickles being in the fridge. But this really seems to just misuse the existential quantifier, and either it commits us to really strange entities called states of affairs, or you can't really say that something exists by virtue of being in a specific position. It seems that my pickles exist whether or not they're in the fridge or in the pantry. So something else has to be existing as well. And whatever that thing is seems like a strange beast to let into our ontology. Basically, as with truthmakers, trying to find out exactly which kind of truth bearers and truths we want to allow into our ontology seems problematic. As a skeptic, this is not going to be something that concerns me. And some other theories of truth will be equally nonplussed. But for some theories, truthmakers and truth bearers are going to be very important. And if those theories can't resolve some of the problems presented here of what truth bearers can be true and how truth makers make something true, they're going to have substantial problems. Whew! That was truth makers and truth bearers. Next up, we're going to be looking at the correspondence theory of truth, which uses a lot of the ideas of truth makers and truth bearers, probably more than any of the other theories we're going to look at. Then the identity theory of truth, the coherence theory of truth, pragmatism about truth, deflationary theories of truth, pluralist theories of truth, Alfred Tarski's truth schema, Kripke's trimodal truth logic, revision theories of truth, and finally the two truth theories of Tibet, or rather the two truths of Tibet. If you're interested in truth makers and truth bearers, there's a lot of literature out there. A good place to start would be with Fraser McBride's Truth Makers in the SEP, but the SEP also has other great resources on this information. This was just kind of a basic introduction to a bunch of the positions. Like I said, there's a lot more to get to. I don't know about you, but I want to go eat some pickles and quail eggs. So watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.